Just before I started making this program today, 13th June 2024, further news started to trickle in from Ukraine, which suggested a further deterioration of Ukraine's military situation on the battlefronts in eastern Ukraine. And the most important news, the event that's perhaps attracting the most attention, is a report from the Ukrainian mapping project, Deep State, which has apparently some kind of contractual relationship with the Ukrainian military's general staff. Anyway, they are now reporting that the Aggregate plant in Volchansk, the big factory in northern Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, that this factory has now passed fully under Russian control. Now, that is correct. This is a major blow for the Ukrainians. It would mean that Ukrainian forces in the so-called Citadel area, a group of high-rise buildings located immediately to the north of this factory area, which has supposedly just been captured by the Russians. Anyway, it would confirm that the Ukrainian troops in this high-rise area are now totally cut off from any prospect, immediate prospect, of resupply. And given that that is the case, one would suppose that resistance by the Ukrainian troops in this high-rise area could not be sustained for very long. Now, Deep State is an interesting mapping project. It has some kind of a relationship, which I don't think anybody fully understands, with the Ukrainian general staff. I get the sense that what actually happens, the true nature of the relationship is this: the Ukrainian general staff regularly publishes bulletins about the progress of the war, which basically fulfill the marketing needs, if I can put it like that, of the Zelensky government. But at the same time, they still need to keep their people fighting on the ground accurately informed about what is actually going on the battlefronts. And so they had this relationship, some kind of contractual relationship with Deep State, which publishes what is in fact the real picture. And given that it is Deep State telling us that the Aggregate plant has indeed fallen to the Russians, and that the Russians are indeed in control of the industrial zone in Volchansk, I suspect that this is information that comes from the Ukrainian General Staff itself, and which is therefore probably true. Now, you will notice some degree of hesitation, and the reason I am hesitating is because Group of Forces North, are, for the moment at least, not confirming this situation. On the contrary, their very latest report, which admittedly was published late yesterday, they seem to be suggesting that the fighting in the Aggregate plant area is still taking place. Now, this is what Group of Forces North, in its Telegram channel, Severny Vieter, North Wind, what they reported yesterday. On June 12th, the North Group of Forces continued the liberation of the border areas of Kharkiv region. In the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continued in the town of Volchansk. In the east of the city, the enemy, in groups of about 100 people, since morning made attempts to attack the positions of Group of Forces North. Group of Forces North repelled all counterattacks and disrupted the transfer of reinforcements, destroying up to 40 Ukrainian troops. The TOS 1A Sontsepek were especially distinguished. These are these terrifying short-range, multiple-launch rocket systems that the Russians have, which fire thermobaric warheads that can inflict appalling devastation on fortified positions and even more appalling devastation on troops who are caught in the open. But anyway, so they're telling us, Group of Forces North are telling us about the situation in eastern Volchansk. The Ukrainians have been counterattacking there. Apparently, one company of soldiers at a time, 100 men at a time, but the Russians say that they repelled all of these attacks, that they stood their ground, and that they deployed. The Russians used these flamethrower vehicles, these terrifying TOS-1 vehicles, against the Ukrainians, and that the Ukrainians were defeated. And then they come to discuss the situation in the aggregate plant. And this is what Group of Forces North said yesterday. In the area of the aggregate plant, heavy fighting is going on inside the administrative building. So that was yesterday afternoon. According to the Russians, fighting was going on in the administrative building of the aggregate plant, at least as of yesterday. But this morning, Deep State, this mapping project, perhaps connected to the Ukrainian General Staff, perhaps reporting information which comes from the Ukrainian General Staff. Anyway, Deep State this morning have said that the aggregate plant has now fallen completely under Russian control. I think that this is almost certainly the truth, but we should probably wait for Group of Forces North to confirm this later today. If it is true, as I said, this could be the decisive battle in the overall battle for Volchansk. It would mean that the Ukrainian troops in the citadel area are now, in effect, completely surrounded. They're caught in a cauldron, and they will either have to surrender, or when the supplies run out, they will presumably face complete defeat and destruction by the Russian troops who would have encircled them. Now, I ought to say it's not impossible that some Ukrainian troops in the citadel area will choose, even if most of them decide to surrender, that they might choose to go on fighting. It's been almost completely unreported, but about a couple of days ago, the Russians reported that the very last Ukrainian soldier from the Azov brigade, in the Azovstal factory, in the cellars and tunnels below the Azovstal factory in Mariupol, the very last Ukrainian soldier there has only now finally surrendered. Apparently he was hiding deep in this labyrinth of cellars far underground. He was living off rats, apparently. This is what the Russians say. He's obviously a very fanatical and motivated soldier, but now even he has finally given up the fight for the Azovstal factory. The last Ukrainian soldier in the Azovstal factory has now surrendered. Obviously, in military terms, an inconsequential event, but as I said, the fact that Ukrainian troops can be surrounded in some places, most of them perhaps will indeed choose to surrender, but you might find a few determined souls who will go on resisting to the bitter end, and that might be the fate that awaits some of them in Volchansk. Anyway, the report about Volchansk from Group of Forces North concludes by saying that the total advance of Russian troops in the Volchansk direction was up to 100 meters. Now, given that Group of Forces North said that yesterday it was the Ukrainians who were counterattacking in the eastern part of Volchansk, one must assume, I presume, that this advance of 100 meters that the Russians are talking about must have taken place on the territory of the aggregate plant. So presumably the aggregate plant has indeed fallen, and barring an unexpected success from the Ukrainians in these attacks that they're making in eastern Volchansk, it is likely that the days of Ukrainian resistance in Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, are numbered, and that the Russians will soon be in complete control of the whole of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. Now, I understand, by the way, and in parenthesis, that the greater part of Volchansk is indeed located north of the Volcha River, with the Russians in control of the greater part of Volchansk north of the Volcha River, and with the Volcha River itself being a relatively minor obstacle, and with the Russians having complete control of the air and overwhelming artillery and advantages, and with the Ukrainian troops in this area of Kharkiv, from what I can tell, somewhat disorganized. It's likely that the Russians will at some point decide to advance south of the Volcha River, and that the armored forces who are collecting on the Russian side of the border will at that point be finally committed to the offensive. So, important news altogether from Volchansk, if it's true. Now, I would just add a little to what has been said about these Ukrainian counterattacks. Dima at the Military Summary Channel has given an explanation for them. They seem to be the most intense counterattacks that the Ukrainians have been carrying out in the Volchansk area over the last couple of days. The Russians, as we see, yesterday said that they managed to repel them all. Dima is suggesting that the Ukrainians are trying to break through to trying to capture an area of high ground, and that if they do capture this high ground, it might open an alternative supply line to the Ukrainian troops in the citadel, in this high-rise area in Volchansk from the east. Now, the fact that these counterattacks are taking place, therefore, may be a further confirmation that the report from Deep State is correct, that the aggregate plant has indeed fallen, and that the Ukrainians, realizing that their troops in the citadel area are about to be completely cut off, are trying to find some alternative supply route to reach them. And this is why these desperate Ukrainian counterattacks have been taking place. Now, it looks as if the Russians, for the moment, are repelling these counterattacks. If the aggregate plant has indeed fallen, the initiative in Volchansk would appear to have passed decisively to the Russians. And my guess is that the Russians are likely, as I said, on the brink of capturing northern Volchansk. By the way, there are also reports that the Russians are advancing east of Volchansk towards various small towns and villages that lie to the east of Volchansk. I'm not going to discuss those claims. I don't see any reference to them here in any of these reports that we see on this report from Group of Forces North. I'm going to finish reading the report because nonetheless it is interesting. As I said, it's the only part of the battlefronts where any part of the official Russian military provides us with this level of detail about what is happening. And anyway, let's continue to read what they say. They say in the Lipsy direction, the situation is without significant change. The enemy made one unsuccessful counterattack attempt, lost up to 10 men and withdrew. Artillery is working on Ukrainian positions in Lipsy. The total advance of the Russian troops in the Lipsy direction amounted to up to 100 meters. So, on the one hand, they tell us that there isn't much change. Then they say that, in fact, they've advanced by 100 meters. Clearly, something is happening, though they're not perhaps been telling us a huge amount. And they say that over the past day, that's, of course, the 12th of June, enemy losses amounted to up to 320 troops, which is, by the way, a high total for Ukrainian losses in the Kharkiv front. It gives us some idea of how fierce the fighting in the aggregate plant has been, and because from what they say, that's where the main fighting has been happening. And then we get a list again of the artillery and other equipment of the Ukrainians that the Group of Forces North claim to have destroyed. And then they finish with this rather interesting discussion. The enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, started active operations in the east of Volchansk from the direction of the village of ETHEREUM and intends to dislodge the units of the Group of Forces North from the dominant heights. This is this higher area that Dima was discussing in his report on the Military Summary Channel. The main goal is to break the way to the area of high-rise buildings in the city centre, where the situation for the Ukrainians is becoming more and more deplorable. So the aggregate plant is about to be lost. That is as of yesterday. The Ukrainians trying to capture this high-rise area, this higher elevation, this hill, to try to open an alternative route towards the Ukrainian defenders in the citadel area. But as we see, Group of Forces North tells us that all of those attacks yesterday was repelled. And then they go on to tell us this: as we expected, the Ukrainian command does not spare the personnel and easily sends whole platoons of Marines. So we're told that the counterattacks in eastern Volchansk are indeed being conducted now by the 36th Marine Brigade, which the Ukrainians have redeployed from Kherson region. So easily sent whole platoons of Marines to the slaughter. We would like to emphasize the work of our electronic warfare, which has halved the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones. So, an interesting, very, very detailed explanation of the state of the battle from the Russians in Volchansk. I suspect that by this evening, the situation in Volchansk will have become a lot clearer. As I said, it's clear that some kind of big battle is underway, but all the indications are that it is the Russians who have the initiative. Now, if the fighting in Volchansk is fierce, if the fighting in Kharkiv region altogether is fierce, the same is true everywhere else on the battlefronts. There's intense fighting now going on in the Kupiansk area, north to the south of Kupiansk itself. The Russians appear to be storming many villages in this area. There's intense fighting going on. Ukrainian losses are extremely high. There are reports that the Russians have made further advances in and around the town of Siversk, further south, and that they're now coming, advancing up the railways towards this railway junction called Vimka, and that they're in the process of storming. They've now entered, apparently, and are storming the village of Razdolovka. And there was even a report yesterday that following the capture of Belogorovka, that the Russians have also captured the chalk fill, which is just next to Belogorovka, which was an important Ukrainian defensive position. So intense fighting going on there as well. I still get the sense that the main battles, however, are happening in Chasiv Yar and in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. Now, the battles in Chasiv Yar, again, we're getting fewer reports about what is going on there. I suspect that for the moment, the major focus of the Russians is in clearing the western part of the western buildings of the micro-district, which are still held by the Ukrainians. But the main battle, perhaps the biggest battle that's taking place at the moment in any part of the Ukrainian conflict is the battle which is taking place in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. And I say that, it's important to say that the area of territory that is being fought over is very large indeed. It's difficult for me to give an estimate of the number of troops that the Russians and the Ukrainians have in this area. But if you look at the territorial extent of it, it covers what must be many tens of square kilometers of territory. So the Russians appear to have captured, or at least all the reports say that they have captured Novo Alexandrovka. There are reports that they have now reached and are preparing to attack Vozdvizhenka. There is a very detailed discussion of all of this on Redovka, Russian newspaper published in Smolensk, very close to the fighting. There are also reports that the Russians have now either captured or are about to capture Sokol, and that they are, in fact, also beginning another attack. This is another village west of Cheretino, and that they're starting the attack on Yevgenivka. It's been suggested that the Russian objective, the immediate Russian objective, once Sokol and Yevgenivka have been fully captured, is the important village of Progress, which lies immediately to the west. The Russians edging closer to cutting all the big supply roads here. And as has been pointed out, they also seem to be moving gradually towards, they're starting to get closer and closer now to the important towns, the much bigger towns of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. And I think it's difficult now to dispute realistically that it is indeed Pokrovsk and Mirnograd that are Russian objectives. Now, Pokrovsk has a population of about 50,000 before the war. Mirnograd is apparently somewhat smaller. So these are big, built-up areas. It's important to say that if you look at a map, by my very inexact calculations, the Russians have now covered more than half the distance from Avdiivka towards Pokrovsk. So we can see that they're moving closer and closer now towards Pokrovsk. The point about Pokrovsk and Mirnograd is that they are not just important towns in themselves, but that they are major logistical centres of the Ukrainian army. And the other thing to say about them is that they were never fortified in the way that the towns closer to Donetsk city, towns like Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Krasnogorovka, Marinka were fortified, because these were areas that were supposed to be located well to the rear of the Ukrainian forces, which were in effect besieging Donetsk city, and which were instead basically being used as logistical and supply hubs. Now, I'm not suggesting that if the Russians reach Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, which is probably going to take some time before they do eventually reach these places, I'm not suggesting that the Russians will be simply able to move in and capture these places in a few days. There would no doubt be intense fighting, but it might not be fighting of the level of intensity as we've seen in places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka and others. And of course, with every Russian advance, the Ukrainians also gradually are running out of operational depth in which to organize their defenses. Anyway, it's an interesting situation in this part of the battlefronts. Novo-Alexandrovka apparently has fallen. It looks as if Sokol might have fallen as well. Other places also, other villages and places falling too. A large part of Karlovka has now also fallen as well. So the Russians gradually moving closer and closer to Pokrovsk. And, well, there don't seem to be strong Ukrainian defences standing in their way, and the Ukrainian forces that are trying to cover Pokrovsk looking increasingly fragile. And further south, another big battle perhaps also shaping up. The Russian news agency TASS is now reporting further Russian advances in Krasnogorovka, that the Russians have gained control of more areas, not just of Krasnogorovka itself, but of more areas around it. There's the situation with the village of Nevolskoye to the north of Krasnogorovka appears to have been finally resolved. The Russian Defense Ministry some months ago claimed that Nevolskoye had been captured by the Russians. The Ukrainians then claimed that they recaptured it. Deep State now says that the Russians are now fully in control of Nevolskoye again. So, which, again, if true, would put Ukrainian positions in Krasnogorovka, what's left of them, in even greater jeopardy than they have been in already. So, a major battle starting to shape up there as well. Krasnogorovka, presumably likely to fall fairly soon. The Russians advancing to in the areas of the south, Novomikhailovka, Paraskovievka under Russian control. The village of Georgievka apparently also under Russian control. The 79th Brigade attempting to defend in this area, complaining bitterly about how far it's been weakened, that it's not receiving the reinforcements that it needs in a situation of conflict with a battalion that was sent to provide reinforcements. Anyway, the whole situation very bad there as well, and likely before long the Russians preparing to mount an offensive in this direction too. As I discussed in my program yesterday, Putin has just held a council of war with the top Russian military commanders. I suspect that the Russians are assessing the whole situation on all of these various battlefronts and are now deciding whether to commit more of their reserves in order to land their punch. Up to this point, perhaps it's more accurate to speak of the Russians conducting offensive operations around the contact line rather than a straightforward offensive. But perhaps that's about to change. Perhaps sometime in the summer we're going to see a proper offensive, a full, actual Russian offensive using heavy armour, mechanised troops, all those sort of machines being thrown into the battle with a view perhaps to exploiting the advantage that the Russians have gained in all of these areas, in Chasov Yar, in the area of Ocheretino and Avdiivka, towards Pokrovsk, in the south, towards Vuhledar. Well, we'll just have to wait and see. So, that's the situation on the battlefronts. Now, a lot of things are now happening elsewhere because we now have another G7 meeting. And in advance of that meeting, we were getting reports that there was a certain amount of resistance being put together against the American plan to give Ukraine a $50 billion loan, which would be secured against the interest of Russian frozen assets. Apparently, the legal advice about taking the capital has proved too strong, and so they're going to go, or at least the plan is that they should go against the interest only. Now, to the extent that I can understand the American plan, it works like this. The Americans and the other G7 states lend money to Ukraine, $50 billion to Ukraine, supposedly secured against the interest. Now, the interest is, of course, only $3 billion or so a year, so it would take an awful long time to pay off, and the loan might not make commercial sense on that basis. There's also, of course, risks that Ukraine might default on the loan, in which case there wouldn't be enough security. There's also risks that court judgments might go against the Western powers in terms of the use of this interest. Any number of things might happen. So the Americans are saying, let's give the Ukrainians this $50 billion loan secured against the interest of these frozen assets. And of course, given the fact that this is a very high risk loan indeed, the European Union should stand guarantor. Now, the Europeans have been supposedly pushing back on this, and there was a rather evocative article, I think it was in Politico, which had a European official actually say, what are the Americans taking us for? Do they think we're stupid, that we should stand as guarantors for a loan like this? So the Americans lend their money to Ukraine. If everything fails and falls apart, it's the Europeans who carry the tab. Well, it looks as if the Europeans are indeed stupid, because according to the Financial Times, this has now in principle been agreed. This is the report that's just appeared in the Financial Times. It doesn't go into the details, but it tells us that the G7 strikes provisional deal on $50 billion loan to Ukraine. Leaders agree to front-load funding to Ukraine backed by expected profits from Russians' frozen assets. And we're told that a deal on the scheme for G7 members to provide approximately $50 billion to Ukraine, backed by the future proceeds from Russian assets, was struck by the G7 officials. Two people involved in the talks told the Financial Times. Details over its design, including who would bear the ultimate risk of the loan and how the money would be distributed, were not specified in the agreed statement. But then we're told it's done. And this is an official. At Sherpa level, it is agreed, and I do not expect any leaders to block it. There is provisional agreement. Of course, you need formal approval from the G7. So it looks as if the Germans and the Italians and the French have now all but agreed to stand formal guarantors of this loan. It is astonishing to what an extent the Europeans continue to do things, which is so diametrically contrary to their own interests. This is an American idea. It was an American proposal. The Europeans could have, it seems to me, perfectly validly told the Americans, look, we're absolutely not doing this. We can't possibly provide guarantees of the kind that you're asking for. If this all falls apart, the guarantees should be borne by you. But of course, the Americans are not prepared to do that. The Europeans are even more invested in Project Ukraine than the Americans are. They're terrified that if the election in November in the United States results in Donald Trump winning, the Americans might conceivably decide to walk away from Project Ukraine entirely. So it looks as if all the indications are that the Europeans are going to do that which they themselves admit would be idiotic, which is stand guarantors for a loan which is all but certain eventually to fail. Now, anybody who has tracked Project Ukraine, the whole pattern of events since February 2022, should in no way be surprised by this news. We've had example after example of the Europeans agreeing to all kinds of sanctions, which have massively disrupted the energy system in Europe, compromised Europe's energy security. We've seen Europe cut itself off from one of its major markets, which was, of course, Russia. We've seen the Europeans give away the greater part of their air defense systems and surrender some of their aircraft. We've seen the Europeans give vast amounts of money to Ukraine as well. So, given this record, given the fact that the Europeans have wrapped up their investigations into the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, apparently that isn't a matter of any very great concern or interest to European governments, despite the fact that this was a huge European infrastructure project, as well as a Russian one. Well, given all this, why assume, as I think some people perhaps were over hasty to do, that the Europeans would balk at doing this thing which one of their own officials said was idiotic? Now, the people of Europe, of course, are not familiar with all the details of these things. The number of people in Europe who read the media and follow the television news, and even many of them who go to independent media sites. Most of them, most of them, are not going to be aware of these discussions over this $50 billion loan to Ukraine. They won't know, for example, that it is the European public, the European electorates, that stand liable to pay the price if, or rather when, this loan falls apart, so that the Americans can walk away without suffering any loss. But I do get the sense that, notwithstanding the fact that they don't know the details, as is always the way, they sense that an awful lot is going wrong. And that was why we saw the vote that we saw in the European elections. Now, there's the European Parliament elections, which have just taken place. Now, as is well known, the European media has registered significant advances for what is referred to in the media as the far right. Lots of explanations have been provided for the success of these parties. All of this has now provoked an election in France, an actual parliamentary election in France. It's become increasingly clear, by the way, that President Macron of France hardly prepared a proper plan. This was not some great masterpiece of strategy that many people assume it was from Macron. This was more an act of Macron again throwing a tantrum. He didn't get the result he wanted from the European Parliament elections, so he's angrily called national elections to see whether things can be changed, and to spite the various parties in the Parliament which have been supporting him, but which he's clearly angry with. We've seen a meltdown, by the way, in the main centre-right party, Les Républicains, where the leader of the party has been expelled, but is apparently holed up in the headquarters of the party because he's floated the possibility of some sort of alliance with Marine Le Pen's movement. Anyway, we see all the discussion and all the commentary, and it's interesting again that whilst there's much explanation and analysis of what has caused European voters, especially younger European voters, to turn to these so-called far-right parties, it's striking that the conflict in Ukraine does not feature, even though most of these parties, not all of them, but most of these parties are opposed to the sanctions and are generally skeptical about Project Ukraine. I think that everything is connected, and I think that it is precisely because these parties oppose Project Ukraine and that many people in Europe are becoming deeply nervous and skeptical about Project Ukraine, that explains why we have seen the vote that we have seen. People may not understand all of the details. They may not be following all of the details, but they sense at a certain level that something is wrong. That is always the way, in my experience, in democratic elections. And this ridiculous situation with the $50 billion loan is another example. Most people in Europe will not know about the details of the loan. They won't know about the fact that their leaders are committing them to stand as guarantors for it. But they sense that something is wrong, and the behaviour of their leaders over the question of this loan is another example of why they are right to think that. So anyway, we are going to get this loan, and it will materialise. It will be signed off by the Europeans over the course of this G7 summit. The Americans always get their way on all of these things, and we will no doubt see the shape of that within the next few days. Now, even as the Europeans capitulate to the Americans over the loan, the Americans have announced further sanctions. And these have come, I believe, from Janet Yellen. And they're very interesting because, of course, the Americans have proposed further sanctions on all sorts of Russian companies and business people and people that they say around the world are trading with the Russians. And they're making it all but impossible for people to trade in dollars and euros with the Russians. This isn't a huge issue for the Russians anymore because they themselves don't like to trade any longer in dollars and euros. But anyway, the most interesting thing, the most striking thing is that the Americans are now expanding what they call their secondary sanctions. And they're coming up with a very interesting rationalization. They're saying that since Russia is now a war economy, any financial institution anywhere in the world that has dealings with the Russians in any form, on any issue, even if it's only, for example, to provide financing for a export of, shall we say, mattresses, bed mattresses to Russia, they run the risk of being sanctioned because they are supporting the Russian war economy. So describe the entire Russian economy as a war economy, and you can accordingly impose sanctions on anybody who does any trade with the Russians at all. First and foremost, financial institutions. Now, whose financial institutions are the Americans targeting? Well, it's not difficult. A couple of weeks ago, we had Secretary of State Tony Blinken coming to Beijing, warning the Chinese that if they continued to conduct relations with China, with Russia, economic relations with Russia, if they continue to conduct their trade with the Russians, then the US would start to sanction Chinese banks. And of course, it is Chinese banks that the US is now targeting. And the key thing to understand is that the United States knows perfectly well that the Chinese are not going to curtail their economic and trading relationship with the Russians. For China, it is a strategic priority. The Chinese are fully aware of American plans to intensify the economic blockade, as the Chinese would see it, against them. They know about American plans to create hellscapes, as the Americans put it, for the Chinese fleet in the area of Taiwan. They can see American plans to accelerate the process of Taiwan ultimately seeking secession from China. The Chinese are also aware of American plans to begin co-production of missiles and other equipment with Japan. So from the Chinese point of view, they need allies. They need people at their rear who can supply them with the raw materials and the food and agricultural products that they need to withstand what might very well turn out to be, and what almost certainly would turn out to be, ultimately, a American siege. So they're not going to curtail their economic relations with the Russians. They have, in fact, repeatedly said as much. They've just said as much now. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman has come out and has spoken out against these latest sanctions that the United States is planning, is announcing, which clearly, ultimately, are intended to target Chinese banks. And that, of course, brings us to what these sanctions really are about. They are not anti-Russian sanctions. They are anti-Chinese sanctions. The United States does not want to impose, for the moment, sanctions on China openly, because that would be an admission, a public admission, that the relationship between the United States and China has collapsed, and that the two countries are in a hostile situation as one against the other. That might not be popular with many business people in the United States, and it would be very unpopular with many business people in Europe who are showing increasing frustration of the whole direction of Western policy. So the United States is now preparing to start sanctioning Chinese banks and financial institutions. It is intending to start a sanctions war against China, but it is masking these sanctions by pretending that they're not actually anti-Chinese sanctions at all, which they self-evidently are. It is going to pretend that they are anti-Russian sanctions. This is what this whole thing is ultimately all about. The Chinese know it. The world outside the West can see it too. We are starting to see how the sanctions war that the United States initiated is getting further and further out of control. I think it was around 2 years ago when the United States first announced some seemingly unimportant sanctions against a few Chinese officials that my colleague Alex Christoforou and I said on a program for the Duran that the United States has just climbed onto the sanctions escalator with respect to China, and that as night follows day, that sanctions escalator is going to go up and up and up, and in time we're going to see comprehensive American sanctions against China, just as we're seeing comprehensive American sanctions against Russia. They will take a different form. They will initially target China's financial services industry rather than Chinese trade in goods. But we're now firmly on that sanctions escalator, and it has gone up a massive rung. And people should understand that there is no end point to this, just as the only end point with Russia was a complete cut-off of the Russian economy from the Western economy. If the political leadership in Washington does not change, if the policies that are conducted by the US government do not change, we are going to end up eventually in that same position with China too. Now that will not be good for the US economy, which relies heavily on cheap Chinese goods, and it will probably increase inflationary pressures over time in the United States, but it is going to be devastating for the European economies as well. Now, you might have expected the European leaders to be unhappy about this, to have publicly pushed back against it, to have criticised the Biden administration for doing it, for calling in the Americans and saying to them, this goes altogether too far, we can't support this. But no, just as is happening now with this latest $50 billion loan, which is going to be ultimately the Europeans that are going to repay. So it is going to be the Europeans who are going to pay the biggest price for this sanctions war that the Americans are planning ultimately to wage against China as well. Now, the other side, of course, is starting to respond. We're told that, well, there's just been a apparently very successful BRICS foreign ministers meeting in Russia. We're going to have, apparently the work is now underway for the BRICS summit, which is pending in Kazan in September. Vladimir Putin has said that the Russians and the Chinese and the other BRICS states are now working hard on developing their own financial architecture to facilitate mutual trade. We've seen how Saudi Arabia apparently is now taking further steps to edge away from exclusive use of the dollar in its oil trade. It's not to say that the Saudis aren't going to continue to accept dollars. They will. But they're starting to slowly, gradually shift away from dollars, or at least the exclusive use of the dollar as well. So the rest of the world can see what is happening. They sense that the Americans, however, are going to continue along the course that they're taking. They're responding not so much by counter-sanctioning the Americans or the Europeans, but by basically creating their own global and financial networks. And I'm going to say the ultimate point of all of this, given the balance of economic power that exists in the world now, is that we're going to see not China, the BRICS, pushed back, isolated, forced into economic stagnation. That will be what will happen to the Americans and to the Europeans instead. They are working with a completely obsolete and out-of-date idea of the true weight of economic power. I've discussed recently how I think that the Western leaders still understand the economic balance in the world on the basis of nominal GDP, as opposed to GDP recalculated on the basis of purchasing power parity. We've seen that they have massively, gravely, catastrophically misjudged the size of the Russian economy. They thought it might have been perhaps a fifth of its true size because they were working with nominal GDP rather than with actual purchasing power parity GDP. They're making the same miscalculation about China as well, in my opinion. They still believe that the US has the bigger economy than China does, even though the World Bank says that on a purchasing power parity basis, China's economy stands at $35 trillion, as opposed to the US economy, which stands at just $27 trillion. My own view is that the gap is greater, just as I happen to believe that, just as I've long believed, that Western GDP calculations of the Russian economy greatly understated the true size of the Russian economy. I've been arguing this for years, and I feel that I've now been vindicated on this very issue. So it seems to me that the truth is the same with China. I happen to believe that China's true GDP level is not $35 trillion, as the World Bank estimates. I think it is significantly bigger than this, though as I do not know the Chinese economy as well as I do the Russian, I'm not going to try to even guess its true size. But if the Chinese economy, in terms of overall economic activity, is now twice the size of the American one, I, for one, would not be surprised. But it's very unlikely that President Blinken, Ursula von der Leyen, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, any one of these people, Rishi Sunak, Olaf Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, that any one of these people understand any of this. One might have expected that the failure of the Russian sanctions would have told them that things in the world are different from the way they thought they were. One might have expected that the revelations about the true size of the Russian economy was a warning. I doubt that they have learnt anything from this, because of course they're not in the same world of facts that people like myself are in. So they don't just make the same mistakes again and again, they make them on an ever bigger scale. And as for the Europeans, as we've seen with the $50 billion loan to Ukraine, and as we're going to very soon see with the American sanctions against the Chinese banks, well, there's a sucker every time, and this time it is them. Well, this is where I'm going to end today's program. Shorter video today. Let me remind you again quickly that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all sorts of amazing things there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, and our new Football 24 range. And last but not least, if you like this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.